first, thanks to Jay and James for the invitation to come speak today, and it's been a great time being at this conference and hearing all the interesting research that's going on, and I think we can all agree this is a very valuable symposium to bring everyone together. Okay. No. So here's the outline of what I'm going to speak with you about today. So I'm going to give you some background on the science family of journals, discuss translational research, focusing on STM, and then discuss the review process in detail and a spotlight on some of the publications we've seen in this field and helped publish this past year, and finish with a couple tips for writing a good translational research paper. So I first need to mention that science is published by AAAS, or the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the largest scientific society with over 120,000 members. It's an international society, and its main goal is to advocate for science and society. And so it includes a lot of resources for education, policy, career development, and global outreach. So I encourage everyone to take a look at the AAAS website if you haven't already been familiar with that. And I should also mention that AAAS is a nonprofit, so science is published by a nonprofit. So you're probably all familiar with the flagship journal, Science. It's been around for a very long time. It has a nice broad scope, including biological life sciences and social sciences, in addition to physical sciences. It's cross-disciplinary by nature, and its focus is highlighting important advances with broad implications. Science Advances is one of our newer journals, and it's our only open access journal at the moment. And it has a similar broad scope, which is why I'm mentioning it now. So it's a similar broad scope to Science in that it publishes both life science and physical science and social science. And it's also interested in publishing advances in science, as the name implies. Translational medicine I listed next because we have a broad scope within the biomedical realm. So we're interested in preclinical to early phase clinical trials, so anything that can be considered translational research with an impact on human health and disease and patient care. We also publish health policy-related discussions and taking clinical observations back to the bench side to understand molecular mechanisms of disease. Science Signaling is our fourth journal now, focusing on signaling mechanisms and cellular regulation. We've seen some references to science signaling papers during this conference. Science Robotics is one of our newer journals as well, focusing on everything robotics related. And then our last is Science Immunology, focusing on advances in the immunological realm related to interdisciplinary science with a focus on immunology, human and non-human. Now I should also mention open access here. So as I mentioned briefly, Science Advances is our only gold open access option at the moment, meaning that authors pay publication fees and then the article is freely available without a subscription. The other journals operate on a green open access policy where authors pay some publication fees, the rest is paid by subscription, and non-subscribers can also gain access with a fee. We do have several other ways that articles can be made available to interested parties. We operate with self-archiving, meaning that if funder mandates, we ask authors to deposit their accepted publication onto PubMed 6 months after the publication date. We can provide referral links to authors so that anyone who clicks on that link can access a copy of the paper free of charge. That link can be posted on your lab website. That can help gain access to your article. And we do free up our articles 1 year after publication. So now focusing on translational medicine, which is the journal I work for directly. So we are a leading journal in peer-reviewed research publication at the intersection of biomedical sciences, engineering, and medicine. We're focused on implications for clinical applications and human health. So our goal is to promote human health by providing a forum to communicate, discuss, and advance the latest research in the biomedical field. So when we think about translational research, we have three main pillars that we think of. The traditional definition of moving something from the bench to the bedside, so from early preclinical through early clinical trials. Then we have the reverse, where you take a clinical observation and bring it back to the lab to understand mechanism, and this can include why a drug failed at a clinical trial. And then the last pillar of translational research we see is using research findings to inform regulatory policy or improve community health in a broad sense. So what types of articles do we publish? We have 2 formats for our research articles. The standard format is 8 figures, 10,000 words. That's a nice long size with a large supplementary material allocated also. And then we have a short report format within our research article. We also publish reviews, focus and perspective articles as some of the front end that can synthesize recent advances, put them into context for the field, and discuss implications of new research findings. And then we also publish editorials and policy discussions, things like that. So what are we interested in, and what do we consider translational research? We're really interested in anything that has an impact on human health. So this can be cancer, it can be genetics, genomics, cardiac, obviously, vascular disease, stem cells, regenerative medicine, diabetes, metabolism, medical imaging. So anything that has an impact on human health, we're interested in. So who's running this journal? So we're a team of 6 editors. We're managed by Orla Smith. She's our managing editor. Yevgenia handles our cancer papers. Lindsay handles immunology and infectious disease. I handle bioengineering, cardiovascular, and musculoskeletal. Mattia handles our neuroscience and is getting into our fibrosis papers. And Catherine handles our metabolism, genetics, and genomics. Now, we also have a very large scientific advisory board led by our 2 co-scientific advisors listed at the top here. We have about 60 investigators at institutions around the world who we can tap on to help evaluate those papers that are submitted. They give us a brief set of comments on papers and really help keep a pulse on the field, because as staff editors, we're no longer conducting research. We are professional editors, not involved in any research activities anymore, whereas our chief scientific advisors are either involved in research or in some with company-related activities as well. And they really help keep the finger on where research is headed and what are the newest advances within specific subfields. And having this nice panel of about 60 advisors also helps us be able to cover a broad range of fields, because with only a team of 6, we can't be experts in every single field. And so I think this is a very important part of our journal that I'm really happy that we have. I should mention that all 6 of us do have scientific backgrounds, as I mentioned, for the areas that we handle, and we've all gone through advanced degrees and postdoc experience. This year's our 10th anniversary, so we were started in 2009 in October. As part of this 10th anniversary, we're putting together a focus series that really is highlighting what I like to think of with translational research. So it's a bit of a where are we now? We're looking back at some of the early papers that we published during the first couple years of the journal and looking at how the fields that those papers covered have progressed over the last decade. So watch for this every month. We're publishing 1 focus article. We've put 2 out already on microbiome and CAR T cells. So if you're interested in seeing where things are now, keep your eyes peeled for that. So I'm going to transition into the review process. So as we've heard throughout this conference, there's an increasing need for robust, reproducible, and responsible research. And so the journal's mission is to publish high-quality research that meets those criteria. And one of the ways that we do that is by facilitating the peer review process. Now, we all know that there's some issues with peer review, but for right now, it's the best system that we have. And as editors, our job is to facilitate that process to the best of our abilities to ensure that each paper gets a fair shake and it has as smooth as possible review experience. So when a paper is submitted to the journal, this is the process that occurs behind the scenes. So we do read all of the papers that we receive. We read the cover letter. We read, the materials and methods and everything. Unfortunately, we're not able to review all of the articles that we receive, and I'll get into the number of papers we receive weekly later. But we do that deep dive initial evaluation with the help of our advisory board, if possible, and then ultimately decide whether or not to send that paper out to review based on whether it meets criteria in terms of novelty and quality of data and such, which I'll discuss in more detail later. So for those papers that do make it to review and then are given an opportunity to revise, after we receive that revised manuscript, we'll usually almost always send it to re-review, especially if new data are added. And then, unique to our journal, we do perform an editing during that revision period prior to accepting the paper. And when we're editing, we are also trying to make sure that responsible conduct of research has been upheld through the study design and through the process of, forming that paper before it's published. And so what that means is we're looking for things like sample sizes, we're looking for appropriate statistical analysis, appropriate controls, discussion of translational implications and limitations of the study conducted and limitations going forward in trying to translate this into a therapy if it's not at that stage at the moment. And appropriate discussion of data and materials availability, listing competing interests, patent applications, relationships with companies, listing funding sources. So we're really trying to make sure that everything's in that paper so that there's not only enough methods details so you could reproduce that study if you wanted to, but we're also highlighting the findings of that paper in the appropriate context, and you're not overstating claims that aren't supported by the data. So here's the numbers. We receive about 75 manuscripts each week in a variety of fields. They're assigned to different editors, and then we tap our advisory board. We end up reviewing about 20 to 25% of those papers, and then we ultimately end up publishing less than 10% of what we originally received. So there are some very high cutoffs here, as you can see, and part of the reason for these strict numbers is to uphold the high standards of the journal and to make sure we are publishing the best examples of translational research that have an impact on human health. So selecting reviewers is a very important part of the review process. We do enjoy when authors send us lists of reviewers they would like to have on their paper. We do also double check all of those suggestions to make sure that there aren't any COIs in there. If you've published with someone in the last 5 years, I can't include that person as a reviewer on your paper. That could be a potential COI. And we do also follow excluded reviewer requests to the best of our ability. And when we're picking reviewers, because we are a translational journal, we need to cover different aspects of the paper. So we need someone with that clinical expertise, we need someone with that basic science expertise, and we need someone with that technical or technology focus so that all parts of the paper can be evaluated in enough depth. So what we're looking for when we receive those review comments and what helps us make a decision on the paper is discussion of the impact of the finding. The impact not only in the field, but also for other fields. Can other people learn something from this paper? Because we have such a broad scope, we need to make sure that we're publishing something that has implications for other avenues of research. And during that review process, almost everything requires a revision. It's very rare to get a paper that's all together at that first stage. So how much more needs to be added to the paper to support the conclusions, and how much more would it be nice to have, but maybe it's unrealistic? And so having that listed in the review is very helpful for the editor, because then we can help guide through the revision process and help make sure that there's enough in that story so that there's a complete data set that supports the conclusions, but we're not expecting multiple years of work. That's too much to ask for in one paper. So some common reasons that papers don't end up making it: too small of an advance, and these are really hard to quantitate. The review process really helps tease out whether this is a large enough advance for the field and whether this has implications for other fields. So that is one of the reasons that this is such an important part of the publication process. Unconvincing data and poor study design is a major reason for rejection, because it's too much to ask. If there's poor study design, it basically means we would need the entire study to be repeated, and that's too much to ask for a revision. On the converse, common reasons for acceptance: the study asks and answers an important question with sufficient detail and sufficient data to support the conclusions, and the results provide new insight that will lay the foundation for future research avenues. So peer review, as I mentioned, it's not a perfect process, but it's what we have right now. These are a lot of the complaints we hear about the process. One thing we're trying to do to improve that is we are implementing cross-review when it's possible, and this during this process, we will ask reviewers to weigh in on the other review comments, and this can kind of provide a check and balance to see if we feel that the paper's gotten a fair shake throughout the review process. Now, we aren't doing this for every paper, but it is something that we are pursuing, and we're certainly open to feedback from our reviewers as well as to ways that we can improve this process. So a little more in detail of what we're looking for in papers. As I mentioned, it's kind of similar to what we're looking for in those review comments. Is this a new concept? Does it catalyze new directions of research? Is it impactful for the field? Does this have clinical insight? And can this be translated all the way to a new therapy? In more nuts and bolts terms, what are specific things we're looking at? We're looking at sample sizes. We're looking at discussion of limitations, translational challenges, blinding and controls. Were they incorporated in the study design? Did the study receive appropriate approval and oversight? Is there a study design paragraph in the paper detailing all the important aspects of the study design? Timing of intervention is very important. If you're trying to develop a therapy and you're administering it very soon after you initiate your model, your disease model in your animal, is that really representative of the human condition? And most important for us, what is the direct human connection in this paper? Is there human or cell analysis? How closely does your animal model relate to human disease? So we really want to be publishing things that have clinical impact. And to do that, we do need that strong human connection. Just to touch on some of the papers we've published this year in the cardiovascular bioengineering realm, we've had some papers on arrhythmia, on tissue engineering and nanomedicine, on heart failure, pulmonary hypertension, on devices, genetics, and then some front-end pieces, a review on cardiac differentiation of pluripotent stem cells, a perspective on biomaterials that was a little more broad within the bioengineering realm, and then, of course, an ongoing discussion on policy. So just to end with a couple practical tips for writing a research article. So the most important, I think, is to know your audience and to know when you're submitting your paper to the journal, and specifically to our journal, our audience is very broad. So we're read by clinicians, basic scientists, people in regulatory and companies, and to make sure that what you put into your paper, every word in every sentence says what you really mean. So this might be taking this a little, you might not have thought about it this way, but if you need to explain your study to your family, they might not be scientists. They might not understand what you're doing. You need to give them enough information that they can appreciate what's important about your finding. If you translate that to someone with a scientific background different than your own, do they have enough information to understand why this is important for your research and what could it mean for others studying in a similar or a dissimilar field? When you're writing, think about a funder, someone who doesn't have a lot of time but really wants to understand the key concepts. So put that in your abstract. Put what were the important findings of your study. What does this mean in the greater context for understanding disease or developing therapy? And then similarly, when you're writing, think about your editor. We want to be able to absorb what you're trying to tell us and why it's important as efficiently as possible so that we can get your paper through the process. A little bit more about thinking like an editor, and this comes into play when we're evaluating manuscripts and then when we're making that decision based on the review comments. What are the reasons to support publishing this paper, and do they outweigh the reasons to reject it? Is this a significant advance? Is this well supported by the data? These things on the left-hand side, if I'm having trouble grasping the message because of writing, we can fix that during editing. Is the core content there that really is supporting, an important finding that other people can draw from? This is just more of the same, basically. Is this original? Are the data reliable? Was responsible conduct followed? Is this reproducible? And then presentation, this can all be fixed during the editing process, but it's really helpful if you think about this during the initial writing process, and it'll make your paper received much more easily and much more favorably if you think about this during the initial writing process. So this is the last slide. Last thing, the cover letter is your chance to speak directly to the editor. Keep it short, keep it snappy. Make sure you change the name of the journal if you're reusing it, and have someone else look at it and see, do they understand what was really important about your study and why should this paper be published? So that's all I have for you today. I'm really happy to take any questions, and I hope this was helpful.
So Dr. Czajka is, by training, is cardiovascular and bioengineering. So Caitlin is the second time attend our meeting, and I'm hopeful you'll take this as your home, and you'll take all of us journal, take we to your home. And questions?
Yeah, thanks very much. Look, there's no doubt that one of the problems with the big journals is they've got a bias against negative findings. They tend to publish breakthroughs and iconoclastic findings. What's the policy of science translational medicine, and more importantly, what's the reality? In other words, what percentage of negative papers have you published in the last 2 years?
So I can't give you a number for the percentage of negative papers we've published, but I do see your point, and I think I agree with you that this is an issue. I would say it extends just beyond the journal's perspective, in that I think it's hard to get a negative finding through the review process sometimes. I will say that we have published papers that might not seem like obvious positive findings, and by those I mean papers that look at why a drug failed or why a trial failed, and then try to take that back and dissect some of the mechanism. So in that context, I can say we have published some studies that might not be obvious positive findings, but I agree with you that there is an ongoing need to be putting these negative results out there, because there's a lot we can learn from failures.
We had a lucky enough to get a publication with your journal, and you almost rewrite completely. So it will be you or your colleague. You have a team rewrite a paper. That's quite a surprise, but.
So we are very hands-on during that editing process, and it's because we really want your story to have the most impact it can. And sometimes it's just the small things, like rearranging sections that you have so they flow better, making sure important details are in there so that whoever's reading it really wants to finish to the end and get the main points of your study.
So it is you?
Yes.
To follow that, what role do the editors-in-chief have after you've finished with it, or do they have any role with individual papers?
So by editor-in-chief, you mean Jeremy Berg running the science journals?
Fitzgerald and...
So our scientific advisory board, co-chief scientific advisors, so they play a role in the initial evaluation process. I will say that our chief scientific advisors do not see every paper. They have their own areas of expertise, and they will see papers within those fields. They're also brought in if there are issues with the review process that we cannot handle without their input. So they do play a role in that initial evaluation for papers that are within their fields.
Every paper?
No, not every paper, but within their fields, we can tap on them as an advisor. And they do also play a role in some of our policy pieces and things like that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you.
You take us to your home.
Okay.
So according to schedule,